Hello, BookTube. This is the Rambling Raconteur, Jack, and I'm back to discuss a few more of my first-time reads in 2019 that I really appreciated. And the first video was first-time reads that really were just in the general fiction literature category. This time it focuses on sort of two genres. One is nonfiction, mostly memoir or essay, and the other then is a subgenre of sort of crime, crime adjacent spy novels and such. And so I thought I would jump in first with the nonfiction. And the first one I'd like to show is the complete extant writings of Epicurus, the Greek philosopher. And so this was in the Modern Library Stoic and Epicurean Philosophers volume. And particularly good, it has Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius as Stoics, and then Epicurus and Lucretius as Epicureans. And so I'd read On the Nature of Things about a year and a half before I dipped in to read Epicurus. And Epicurus, of course, is very famous as the phrase Epicurean and the pursuit of pleasure. But when you read Epicurus, what you really find is, yes, it's about pursuing pleasure, but there's a recognition that pleasure is ephemeral. It passes by. We're happy when we're eating, but later on we forget even the taste of what we ate, or we see a sight, but we pass on, and that sight's gone. Our life moves on. And so what Epicurus, in pursuing pleasure, what it's really about is recognizing the pleasures that already exist around us, the pleasures that really come from within us, and appreciating those, not necessarily pursuing other pleasures, but really recognizing what is around us and what is more permanent. And there was a great much of it. His extant writings are very brief. There's a few letters and some collected aphorisms. One of the aphorisms that I really appreciated was one. It says, "It is not so much our friends' help that we appreciate as the fact that they would help us that gives us comfort." And that to me is a very true statement. It's not necessarily that we are continually in need of physical help from others, but we have a confidence and comfort in knowing that there are others around us who care and take care of us. And that comfort and confidence allows us to take more risks and to pursue things in our lives that otherwise we may not. And so then the next one I'd like to share is The Book of My Life by Girolamo Cardano. And he's a Renaissance era Italian thinker. In his own time, he did some work with mathematics, and people who have sat through Algebra 2, sort of that level of mathematics work, and in algebra he has a little proof involving, I believe, cubics named after him that he really stole from another Italian mathematician of his era. So not necessarily a great person, but a very funny writer. And his writing is, again, aphoristic. It involves some of his memoirish or essayish. He discusses his childhood and his past. But he's very entertaining. He's very funny. He consistently has a sort of self-aggrandizing view of himself that is quite comical, something to really appreciate and dig into. And a few passages. Let's see. So if the spirit is imperishable, what is the use of vain names? If it is perishable, what do they avail? Asking if we should curse, in a sense. This sort of is typical of his view of himself and of others who are of his like. If you've read the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, then the best are those who lead the contemplative life, like Aristotle and his peers, few though they may be. Cardano, of course, puts himself in that category. And the sun does not cease to be because masses of clouds hide it from view, Nor should you be troubled because though so many bright lamps of learning burn within your private chambers, those without your doors appear to refuse the radiance. Now, it's absolutely ludicrous to ever say that to someone or to write that about yourself. But there are times where we need to feel that, to know that, you know what, I'm doing something that others around me, this isn't popular. This is something that others have disagreed with. That it's goes against the tradition of whatever institution we're working within. But maybe it is right. Maybe it's something that needs to be challenged. And from that perspective, Cardano's definitely someone to keep in mind. Another one. Let's see. Criticized because I stood alone in my opinions, yet it is on this very count that the unicorn is worth so much. Friends are your support in adversity. Flatterers bring you advice. Now, I really liked that one. That one was less self-aggrandizing. I really appreciated that one. The greatest thing in human affairs is to determine the goal of one's endeavors. And just more of that type of thinking and writing, really strong and appreciating the idea of knowledge, appreciating the idea that we are intellectual beings, that we're creative beings, and that we need to dip into that to really find some of the greatest value in our lives. And so now, another nonfiction again that I read in 2019 was Essays Volume 2 of Montaigne. And that's absolutely amazing. Montaigne is one of those just absolutely staggering intellects that exist within humanity. Someone who pushes us to think more deeply than we have, pushes us to reflect and connect ideas, and to really view ideas within ourselves in a way that we don't often get to, and in a way that we need to more frequently. And so I had read the Essays Volume 1 a few years ago and loved it. And then I started Essays Volume 2 and got to the Apology for Raymond Sebone, which is a vast essay. It's a book-length essay. It's well over 100 pages. It's essentially a book within his volume of essays. And so I had finished Raymond Sebone in 2018, and so in 2019 I jumped back into the essays, and those are great to read because some of them are just a couple of pages, some of them are longer, 20, 30 pages, and so they don't have to be read as a body at once. You can dip into them and sort of keep Montaigne in the back of your mind, pushing you to keep thinking, and that's one of the main reasons we read, right? So I read Montaigne, and Essays Volume 2 is right up there with Essays Volume 1. Great, works of wisdom, truly, in human literature and knowledge. A couple of passages in Of Glory. And there is nothing so remote from reason as for us to gain quest of it, meaning glory, for ourselves. For since we are indigent and necessitous within, since our essence is imperfect and continually in need of betterment, it is this betterment that we should work for. Any person of honor chooses rather to lose honor than to lose his conscience. It might perhaps be excusable for a painter or another artisan, or even for a rhetorician or a grammarian, to toil to acquire a name by his works. But the actions of virtue are too noble in themselves to seek any other reward than from their own worth, and especially to seek it in the vanity of human judgments. And I think that those are words to live by. If we are continually seeking glory and external recognition and rewards, and that's our motivation, we will be disappointed eventually. The most fantastic and the most gifted and talented and the hardest working of us will be disappointed if all we are driven by is external motivation. And what we really need to recognize is that we are imperfect, that we have aspects of our lives that we should seek to grow and improve in. And if we can focus on those aspects, if we focus on who we are and how we can become better, not better, more powerful, or more wealthy, but kinder, more compassionate people, wiser people, people who view others the way we're meant to be viewed, and who recognize the good and the betterment and the glory that is in each of us, then that's where we're not let down. That's where we find fulfillment. And one of my favorite sayings is, perfection should not be the enemy of progress, but progress is worth pursuing. And Montaigne really speaks to that, finding what it is in our lives, and not just the ideas and the thoughts we have, but to then take action on those, to take decisions. That statement about losing honor before losing conscience. The integrity of our conscience drives us to take actions. This is not just solipsistic staring and thinking and, in Aristotle's contemplative life, but really having a life of action. So those were 3 nonfiction books that I really just absolutely loved this year. Again, Essays Volume 2 by Montaigne, The Book of My Life by Girolamo Cardano, and then the extant writings, letters, and aphorisms of Epicurus. And so then, massive shift. It's not all about the classics, even though that's my minor. I deeply love genre fiction, especially crime adjacent spy fiction. All of the novels on this shelf across here are sort of spy novels, and then all of the novels along here those are all vintage crime novels. I just absolutely love them. In my rereads, those are books that I go back to, not just because they're thrilling, but I find that those types of books allow authors to speak through characters in a way that a lot of general fiction doesn't. General fiction can be overly cerebral, whereas these types of books allow you to see what's really happening, what's going on in the world. And probably my favorite sort of subgenre within that genre is the work in the latter Cold War era, through the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, where there's that sense of post-Watergate paranoia, the idea that institutions should be questioned, that there are things going on that aren't great. In the U.S., it's Watergate, it's the Vietnam War involvement. In the UK, a big portion of it is the inflation and unemployment of the 70s, and then following that with the austerity of the Thatcher years. And so those books I find really just fascinating, and I find the setting and the way the characters are interacting with each other and with their society just absolutely fascinating. So the first of these is Fat City by Leonard Gardner. And this is this isn't a crime novel at all, but it's almost crime adjacent. It's set in the seedy side of Stockton, California in the 1950s, I believe, or early 1960s. It's a boxing novel, but it's not really about boxing. And it really is, the characters who are boxers, they're not successful boxers. They're existing on the margins of life. They work as itinerant, migrant farm workers or as short order cooks, and they just barely exist, barely survive. They eke out these existences. They pursue glory, and it absolutely lets them down. They betray each other, they betray themselves, and it's dark, but it's an aspect of life that we need to take notice of and pay attention to. There are many more people who exist on those margins of life than exist in the middle class milieu, and we need to pay attention to them and seek to work to craft a society where more people can be successful. This book is just an absolutely stunning look at that life in the shadows. It was filmed in the 70s by John Huston, with Stacy Keach in sort of the main role, and a very young Jeff Bridges in the other acting role, and is a stunning, gritty, drama. And I had seen it and had always wanted to read the book, and for 10 years didn't find a copy of it. It had been published in the great sort of Vintage Contemporaries, which is sort of vintage publishing's 80s hipster uh, sort of sublist of books, and I'd never found a copy. And I finally found this reprint in the New York Review of Books Classics, and really was glad I got to read it. And then the other one is He Died with His Eyes Open by Derek Raymond. It's the first of the Factory novels that he wrote. And so this is set in the UK. It's a division of the London police that basically deals with the crimes that are, unknown victims, John Doe's, Jane Doe's. And he's very skeptical and almost antagonistic with the flashier, detectives within the police force. And I believe it's from the very early 1980s. And it's just a fascinating view of that society, view of how we too often glamorize crime. We too often glamorize villains or the criminal life, the mob life. And Derek Raymond never lets up from the view that there are real people who are really hurt in crime, and that crime, in a sense, shows who the weakest are of society and who the most powerful are of society, and not in a glitzy way, not in a glamorous way. These are, just really stunning looks at the depravity that exists within the human spirit, and the destructive nature that can exist within the human spirit. And it doesn't flinch away from that, but it also doesn't glamorize it in any way. The nameless detectives are working extraordinarily hard to find, find out what's going on, find out this victim's identity, pursue, his life. And what's really fascinating about this one, if you see the cover with the old cassette tape, which those of you who are my age and older will recognize, is the victim had a series of small cassette tapes he was recording as sort of his therapeutic memoirs. And so the narrative delves into those tapes, and we just see how harrowing the life is. And so these I have the second book in that Factory series, and I look forward to jumping into it this coming year. And so again, those are two sort of mystery novels: Fat City by Leonard Gardner and He Died with His Eyes Open by Derek Raymond. That if you're into those crime or crime adjacent fictions, I think these are worth a shot. They're not typical, and sadly they're not commonly in print, easy to find. But if you found one and took a week or a weekend to read it, or a day, depending on how much free time you have, it wouldn't be wasted. It's a different type of crime fiction that really helps just provide that foil of perspective at the very least. So I'll hopefully be back later at some point to share my favorite rereads from 2019. But until then, thank you, BookTube.